Hey everybody, welcome into the Alabama Recruiting Show. I'm Hannah Chalker alongside our Crimson Tide recruiting reporter, Chris Kirshner. Thanks everybody for joining us today. I'm sure that Tide game on Saturday was a little bit closer than you wanted it to be against Mississippi State, but I have to say, what a great showing of depth by Alabama and Nick Saban. I mean, in this case, it was linebacker, but that just shows you that no matter what position and loss after loss after loss, with Alabama, there is always a next man up, and not just a next man warm body they're throwing in there. These are recruits and players that are playing well into the fourth quarter and coming up against a big game against the Bulldogs and probably their biggest test since Clemson in the national championship. What do you think, Chris?
Yeah, I definitely agree. It was a huge test for Alabama on Saturday. Big win for the Crimson Tide. And like you said, 31-24 win, close win on the road. Mississippi State is a really, really tough place to play. And Alabama stepped up. They've had injuries across the board, especially at linebacker. But I think linebacker especially, they can afford to lose guys just because of how well they've recruited over the years at linebacker. And we saw some guys step up. I don't think the defense was that great. The offensive line also was soft in my opinion. So it's going to be interesting to see how Alabama bounces back in 2 weeks against Auburn.
We have a really great show coming up for you today, including an update on quarterback Emory Jones, so you're going to want to stick around for that. But first, let's talk about Butch Jones getting fired from Tennessee, okay? So I know that they really were actually trying to keep him on until the end of the season, but just couldn't do it with that terrible loss to Missouri on Saturday. Oh, Butch Jones. But this is good news for Alabama in a case because recruits are dropping like flies from the Tennessee program, right? So who are some of the guys? We saw what Cade Mays did a week ago. Of course, he is looking more at the Georgia area right now, so not so much Alabama, but what are some of the players that are leaving their commit from Tennessee? Who could be heading towards Alabama's way?
Yeah, I think there are several guys who could, find their way into Alabama's 2018 class. But the only thing with Tennessee and Alabama, especially this year, the guys that they're going up against with Tennessee, Alabama considers these guys backup options. So, at the top of the list as far as Tennessee former commitments now, Alontae Taylor, four-star athlete out of Manchester, Tennessee. Alabama really likes him as an athlete. He can play wide receiver or defensive back. Defensive back is a critical position and need for the Crimson Tide in the 2018 class. They expect Alontae to visit Tuscaloosa after the season. So who knows what happens there. He just got offered by Alabama earlier this month. He called Alabama his dream school. So we'll see what happens there. Another cornerback, four-star J.C. Horn, out of Alpharetta High School in Georgia. He committed to Tennessee actually on SEC Country Live earlier this fall. So he's another guy to watch. But again, Alabama is going to have to miss on several cornerbacks in order for J.C. Horn to find a spot. Now, Horn actually tried to commit to Alabama multiple times this summer and earlier this fall. He definitely wants to be a part of Alabama. It's just a matter of will there be space. And right now, I don't think there will be, just because I think Alabama will land its top cornerback targets in the 2018 class.
Well, maybe there could be a little squeeze of space just in the recruiting class and as a whole, because they did have a decommit. Offensive guard Jarrett Bell has decommitted from Alabama. So how does that impact the class?
Yeah, I mean, Jarrett Bell was never going to sign with Alabama, just to be straight up with you guys. Bell committed to Alabama in the summer, but what I was told over the weekend was that Bell actually never committed to Nick Saban himself, and that's a problem because for any Alabama target, you have to commit to Nick Saban himself in order for it to actually be official. Now, obviously, the Crimson Tide cannot publicly comment on recruits, so that's why Jarrett Bell was continued to be listed as a commitment for Alabama when he actually technically wasn't. So Alabama actually considered his spot open. Alabama is now down to 11 commitments in the 2018 class, but they've considered Jarrett Bell's spot open for several months now. Two guys that Alabama fans can expect the Crimson Tide to continue recruiting on the offensive line. Four-star offensive tackle Penei Sewell out of Utah. visited for the Tennessee game in October. It's pretty much down to Alabama and Oregon right now. I actually spoke to a source close to the program yesterday. He actually believes that Sewell may end up at Oregon just because of his relationship with co-offensive coordinator Mario Cristobal, who was Alabama's offensive line coach last year. Four-star offensive tackle Nicholas Petit-Frere is also a guy that Alabama definitely wants in the 2018 class. So two guys that Alabama fans should get to know over these next few weeks.
And we'll try to give you all the latest updates on them right here on the Alabama Recruiting Show. But the Crimson Tide wasn't the only team to get a big win this weekend. The Miami Hurricanes, Chris, huge win over Notre Dame. So this kind of brings Alabama and Miami now fighting for some recruits. And these aren't two teams that normally fight for recruits. So there are two guys on the list that both teams are looking at, and they're both cornerbacks. Tyson Campbell, 5-star out of American Heritage High School, that's in Plantation, Florida. And Josh Jobe, a 4-star commit. He's already committed to Miami. So how does this come into play now, Alabama versus Miami, facing off for these recruits? And could these guys, could they be in Tuscaloosa next year?
Yeah, I think one of them will end up in Tuscaloosa. It's just a matter of who at this point. Tyson Campbell, he's been Alabama's top cornerback target in this 2018 class pretty much since the start of the year. Alabama considers him a guy who can make an immediate impact if he commits to the Crimson Tide. And there's going to be a lot of turnover in that secondary next season. So to get a guy like Campbell on board committed would be a huge, huge win for Alabama. Now, Campbell was actually at Hard Rock Stadium this past weekend for Miami's game against Notre Dame. He's from South Florida. He's always loved Miami. So a big win like this for the Hurricanes definitely hurts Alabama's chances a little bit, just because that environment down in South Florida this past Saturday was electric. And when these recruits are in electric environments like that, it definitely pushes them toward that school that they're visiting. So there's definitely some buzz right now for Tyson Campbell in Miami. Georgia is also another school that Campbell is strongly considering at this point. For several months now, I've had Tyson Campbell in my mock signing class for Alabama. But when the mock signing class comes out later this week, Tyson Campbell will not be in there. But I will include Josh Jobe in that signing class. Jobe is, like Hannah said, Jobe is committed to Miami at this time. Transferred from Columbus High School to Cheshire Academy in Connecticut to finish out his high school season, because he's 19 years old. In the state of Florida, you cannot be 19 years old and play high school football. But from what I was told over the weekend, even though Miami got a big win, Jobe is from Miami. A lot of his family members want him to attend that school. Jobe actually is strongly considering Alabama at this point. He was not in Miami this past weekend for the team's game, which definitely helps Alabama's chances there, just because he didn't get to see that electric environment. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens with Tyson Campbell and Josh Jobe. But I think as of now, Josh Jobe seems like the safer bet.
So Campbell was in Miami for the game, and Jobe, Alabama feels pretty good about flipping him. So we'll have to just wait and see on those. This is Chris Kirshner. I'm Hannah Chalker. We're getting a lot of great comments and questions in our Facebook Live feed, so please keep those rolling in. We're going to get to them in just a minute. But first, I want to give you the update on quarterback Emory Jones. It's not a recruiting show without talking about QBs. And in this instance, Emory Jones is looking pretty good for Alabama right now. I say that because Ohio State has actually made an offer to QB Matt Baldwin. They're also hosting another guy this weekend, that's 4-star Jaron Williams. So two quarterbacks Ohio State have their eye on besides Emory Jones. I don't know about you, Chris, but that kind of says to me that the Buckeyes are like, I don't know if we'll get Emory Jones at this point. He might commit. How do you think they're feeling?
Yeah, there's definitely concern on Ohio State's end with Emory Jones. This has been going on now for several months. Ohio State wanted Emory to shut down his recruitment. and stop taking visits elsewhere. Emory has gone against Ohio State's wishes, so the Buckeyes staff really needs to get ahead of if Jones goes ahead and flips to Alabama at this point. So we've seen Ohio State offer Jaron Williams, who will be in Columbus this weekend for an official visit. Williams actually decommitted from Kentucky on Sunday. He was actually one of those recruits who was at Miami this past weekend and really loved his time down in Coral Gables. So that's going to be interesting to see if Ohio State can steal some of that momentum from Miami this upcoming weekend when Williams visits Ohio State. So, I just think it's a matter of Ohio State getting ahead of the curve because quarterback is the most important position. You can't lose a guy like Emory Jones. He's one of the top 5 quarterbacks in the country, Under Armour All-American. He's really been viewed as Ohio State's leader of this 2018 class. He's been in communication with other Buckeyes commitments. So, and I know from on Alabama's end that they definitely feel confident that Jones will end up flipping to Alabama. So it's just a matter of when at this point. Jones's season is continuing, his high school season that is. He led Heard County to a first-round playoff win this past Friday. Second round is this upcoming week, so I don't expect any movement as far as Jones and whether he sticks with Ohio State or flips to Alabama at this point. It should be noted that Jones was actually at Auburn this past weekend for Auburn's game against Georgia, but Auburn doesn't really seem like a big player for Emory Jones at this point. It's still between Ohio State and Alabama, just a matter of will he actually go ahead now and flip to Alabama, and I still say yes.
You know who else was in Auburn this weekend? That's Quay Walker, one of Alabama's top linebacker recruits in an area where we've seen them have so many problems with injuries. Alabama needs a guy like this. He was in Auburn in that electric atmosphere. Of course, the Tigers upsetted the #1 team in the country, and Quay is actually good friends with the guy that plays for the Tigers. What does this mean for Quay Walker and Alabama's relationship right now?
Yeah, Quay Walker was always going to be hard for Alabama to just lock down because, like you said, he is really close with Marcavius Bryant, a freshman defensive end linebacker at Auburn right now, former teammates at Crisp County, very good friends. They call each other brothers. That's how close they are. So Auburn was always going to be a very difficult competitor for Alabama on the recruiting trail when it came to 4-star linebacker Quay Walker. But Quay has visited Tuscaloosa several times this fall. He's also visited Auburn several times this fall. But from talking to people close to the Alabama program, a lot of those people feel like Quay Walker will stick with Alabama when he goes ahead and signs. But the interesting part about Quay Walker is that he is one of those verbal commitments right now, but he's not planning on signing early during that early signing period on December 20th through the 22nd. That's because he's still not 100% sure if Alabama is the school for him. He's going to be at the Iron Bowl in 2 weeks. It's another trip for him to Auburn. He's expected to take an official visit after the season. So that's 2 possible trips now to Auburn in the coming weeks. So it's going to be interesting to see if Alabama will be able to hold on to Quay Walker, a guy that Alabama views he can play anywhere in that linebacking core in Alabama's 3-4 defense.
All right, thanks, Chris. That's some great information and something to keep your eye on. Something that you brought up that we'll get to in just a minute is the early signing period. But first, we want to take your comments on our Facebook Live. So keep those rolling in. I've seen some good ones. People are watching from Tennessee. Cynthia says, "Roll Tide." Hey, Cynthia, thanks for tuning in. A lot of people watching from Alabama. I would hope so. So roll Tide, everybody that is sending in Roll Tides. But William Custer has a good question for you. Which recruit committed to Alabama so far do you see as an instant impact player? It's a good question.
It's a guy that is not really talked about much, but it's definitely a clear candidate to be an instant impact guy, and that's Skylar DeLong, nation's #2 punter. J.K. Scott, he will exhaust his eligibility after this season. J.K. Scott has been one of Alabama's top players this year. There's no doubt about it. Punters sometimes aren't appreciated, but J.K. has definitely done a really good job for the Crimson Tide. So Skylar DeLong is likely going to be the guy that fills J.K. Scott's shoes next year. So that's my guy to be an instant impact guy. As far as other guys, you look at the commitment list right here. Jordan Davis has been an absolute beast for his high school in Memphis. He's had 24 sacks this year, a ton of sacks. He's just been an absolute havoc for his high school team. His high school team actually lost this past Friday, so Jordan Davis's high school career is actually over. But he's a guy that I can see making an impact right away next season.
Joel Palmer is watching from Kearney, Nebraska. Thanks for tuning in, Joel. Roll Tide. Jack Stouffer, I can't read. Says RTR from Tennessee. Thanks for tuning in, Jack. Okay, we got a question from Daniel Dennis. What about moving, okay, this is interesting. What about moving Bo Scarborough or Najee or Robinson move to help at linebacker just in case Holcomb and Moses can't get it done? I can't imagine them moving Scarborough and Najee Harris to linebacker, Chris.
Yeah, I mean, they have the body size to definitely play linebacker. I mean, those guys are like 6'3", 220, fast, mobile. I'm sure they can definitely come up in the box and hit some other running backs. So it's definitely an interesting thought, but I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon.
I don't think so, especially with all the injuries at the linebacking core right now. Okay, Cynthia, where did your comment go? They're coming in fast. Keep the questions coming in. Cindy Chad Jenkins says, how is our D-line corners class shaping up?
Yeah, I mean, arguably Alabama's two biggest position groups in need in the 2018 class start at cornerback. Alabama is expected to sign 4 corners in this class, in addition to a safety. Now, Alabama can sign 5 corners and just move one of those guys to safety when they get to campus, either in the spring or summer. The guys that I expect Alabama to land right now at cornerback, we just talked about him earlier in the broadcast, 4-star prospect Josh Jobe, 4-star cornerback Jalen Armour-Davis. He's already committed to the Crimson Tide. 4-star junior college prospect Savion Smith out of Mississippi Gulf Coast Community College, and 4-star prospect Nadab Joseph. I expect those guys to be Alabama commitments and signees when National Signing Day rolls around. Now, as far as the defensive line, that's where things get a little shaky, just because across the board, defensive line depth in the 2018 class, it's really not that deep. There aren't many elite players in this 2018 class. Alabama has one commitment right now on the defensive line, and that's 4-star prospect Stephon Wynn out of IMG Academy. He's a guy, he's like 6'4" and change, over 300 pounds. Definitely a guy that can play defensive tackle in Alabama's defense. As far as other guys to keep an eye on, Jordan Davis, who I mentioned before, he's committed as a jack linebacker right now, but every time I've seen him, he's just been getting bigger and bigger, so he's a guy that Alabama feels will eventually have his hand in the dirt and play defensive end in Alabama's defense. Another guy, 3-star prospect Andreas Fox out of Mobile. I expect Alabama to land his commitment when he makes his announcement. But as far as defensive line depth goes, there's just not that many elite players across the board, and it's something that Alabama is really doing its due diligence now as far as evaluations go.
We'll take a few more comments here. Brian Hutton has a 2-part question. He says, why is Bama not getting the people they need? It seems like they're going other places. And he also says, what happens if Bama loses to Auburn and doesn't go to the SEC championship? What will they be able to make the playoffs, and how does this affect recruiting?
Yeah, I mean, as far as losing to Auburn, Alabama could certainly make the playoffs still with one loss. It's just a matter of how the other teams, finish their season. So it's too early to say what happens if Auburn ends up beating Alabama. But if Auburn does end up beating Alabama, Auburn will go to the SEC championship game. As far as it affecting recruiting, I don't really think it's going to affect recruiting all that much. I know some kids put a lot of stock into, individual matchups, but in Alabama's case, they have such a track record of winning constantly that it shouldn't really affect Alabama all that much. The only interesting part about that is that Auburn will host a lot of Alabama's major targets that weekend, so it's going to be an opportunity for those recruits to see two schools who they're likely considering strongly at this point. So a big win over Auburn on the road in Jordan-Hare that Saturday will definitely do wonders for Alabama as far as recruiting goes. But as far as the first part of your question, why are some targets going elsewhere? Alabama really hasn't missed on many of its targets right now. A lot of those targets that Alabama wants in this class remain uncommitted, so it's not like Alabama is just losing guys left and right to other schools. Yes, they've missed on some guys. Four-star defensive tackle Connis Miller, four-star running back Asa Martin actually chose Auburn over Alabama. Four-star defensive tackle Bobby Brown chose Texas A&M over Alabama. But outside of those three guys, there really aren't that many more players who have chosen other schools over Alabama. So there's really still no reason to be concerned about Alabama's recruiting efforts so far.
Ronald Sloan is asking how many recruits can be signed by Alabama. That's 21?
Yeah, I mean, Nick Saban had, himself said 22. That's because Alabama had 3 guys with delayed enrollment in the 2017 class. Hunter Brandon and Joseph Bulovas took blue shirts, and Jerez Parks is a gray shirt. Jerez Parks will actually enroll in January, while Brandon and Bulovas are actually on campus currently.
All right, last question we're going to take. Joe Simmons is asking about QB commits. I know we touched on this earlier in the show, so if you want to go back once we're off live here and get our update on Emory Jones and his flip-flop between Ohio State and Alabama right now, go ahead and rewind it back. But give everyone a quick update on QB commits, and he's also asking about offensive linemen as well.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, Emory Jones remains Alabama's top quarterback target in this class. It's just a matter of will he or will he not flip from Ohio State. I know Alabama definitely feels like they have a very good chance at flipping him from Ohio State, but again, it just remains to be seen what Emory wants to do. If Alabama misses on Emory Jones, we could see the Crimson Tide go after four-star quarterback Jaron Williams, who decommitted from Kentucky on Sunday. They're still recruiting Tanner McKee, four-star prospect out of California. But McKee will actually enroll in 2020 because at whatever school he chooses, because he's doing a 2-year mission after graduating from high school. So those are the 3 quarterbacks for Alabama fans to know. As far as offensive line, Alabama has 2 commitments on the offensive line: 4-star tackle Tommy Brown out of California and 4-star center Emil Ekiyor. 2 guys for Alabama fans to know on the offensive line: Panay Sewell, Nicholas Petit-Friere, both 4-star offensive tackle targets who have yet to make their commitment.
We're also getting a lot of questions about linebackers. So once we're off air here, you can scroll back. We've already talked about a lot of those commits, so go ahead and scroll back and you can watch our entire conversation there. But now I want to talk really quick about the early signing period. So I know there's been a lot of questions about this, and this is something new this year. So it'll be December 20th through 22nd. There are positives to this. There are negatives to this. It doesn't really affect players that want to enroll early. What are some of the effects? And why is there going to be this big new early signing period?
Yeah, I mean, I know that there's been a lot of talk about the early signing period, over the past few months, actually the past few years. This is something that a lot of coaches have wanted to do for quite some time now. As far as the smaller programs, I think it definitely benefits them to have this early signing period, just because there's been a lot of cases where top schools like Alabama, they miss on guys in January, and then they go to their Plan B and Plan C guys, and those guys may be already committed to a smaller school, say like Missouri, for instance, or Kentucky. And then Alabama comes in with a late offer and says, hey, you want to play for Alabama? And a lot of those times, the smaller schools who built up that relationship and found that diamond in the rough, quote unquote, lose out because a bigger school comes in and swoops in. So I think that's definitely something that the smaller schools definitely are pushing as far as their commitments right now. I know a lot of schools will definitely want a lot of their commitments to go ahead and sign during that early signing period, because if you don't sign during that early signing period and you're verbally committed at this point, it's just going to tell that coaching staff that you may not actually be 100% committed to that program at the time. Because why would you not sign during that early signing period if you've been verbally committed to that program? So it's going to be interesting to see how these programs actually go about their commitments who don't sign during that early signing period. Will we actually see those programs start to drop those kids and start looking elsewhere? Who knows? But it's going to be interesting to see. As you see on the board right now, early enrollees, they don't have to sign during the early signing period. That remains the case. As far as previous signing classes, early enrollees have the option to go ahead and make their signing during the early signing period, or they can wait during the National Signing Day in February. So it really doesn't affect all that much there. As far as impacting the coaching carousel, we've already seen that. Schools have already gone ahead and fired their coaches. They've already started looking at who's going to be that next replacement. We've already seen guys like Jacob Copeland, a 4-star wide receiver who's committed to Florida. He's definitely a flip candidate for Alabama. It's just a matter of will he actually wait for the Gators to sign their next head coach. So it's going to be interesting to see how that affects these guys who may be currently committed to a school who doesn't have a head coach. But it's going to be interesting to see how this early signing period turns out, because I expect mostly Alabama's verbal commitments to go ahead and make that commitment official during that 3-day window in December. I know Quay Walker is one of those guys who we touched on earlier. He is not going to sign during that early signing period. So that just tells Alabama that he's actually not 100% committed, and they'll still have to do some work in January.
You also had a note on there that you think that the early signing period will make February's National Signing Day less intriguing. Why is that?
Yeah, I think just because a lot of these guys, the majority of the top guys are already committed to top programs already. So there's only just a small amount of uncommitted guys at this point. And these big-time guys, these 5-star prospects, they can commit whenever they want. They can sign whenever they want, just because these programs, they'll wait as long as it takes to land those players. So, but right now, we've seen a big shift in a lot of these top guys want to enroll early in school so they can get the potential for early playing time. And we've seen a lot of Alabama's guys. They've had a lot of early enrollees over these past few years. A lot of those 5-star players, just because they want to go ahead and start getting the pads on in January, February, just so they can have the opportunity to play early. So I think that's a big reason why I don't think there's going to be as much intrigue on National Signing Day in February in these next few years.
Chris, you have such great information. Where can people go and find this when we're not live here on the Alabama Recruiting Show?
Yeah, SECcountry.com. Just click Alabama as your team. Make sure you guys click on recruiting after that, and all of our recruiting information will be right there. And
make sure to go follow you on social media at
Chris Kirshner.
All right, Chris Kirshner. I'm Hannah Chalker. You can find me on Twitter as well. Thanks, everybody, for watching the Alabama Recruiting Show. Catch us every Monday right here at 5 o'clock. Roll Tide, and we'll see you next week.